Hello, everyone. Welcome to our ICN webinar at Changing Context for Public Engagement and Global Citizenship Education. Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à notre webinaire du RCC, l'évolution du contexte de l'engagement public et de l'éducation à la citoyenneté mondiale. This webinar will be simultaneously interpreted in English and French. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a symbol that says interpretation, and you can pick your language of preference that you would like to listen to, English or French. Alors, notre webinaire va être interprété en anglais et français. Alors, si vous voyez le dessous de votre écran, il y a un symbole qui dit interprétation et vous pouvez choisir votre langue en anglais ou français. So my name is Sherry, and I'm the ICN National Program Manager. And before we get started any further, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that those of us here hosting this webinar are gathering in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And so we acknowledge that we're in Kapujik, also known as Halifax. If any of you attending the webinar happen to know the land that you are on, please feel free to share in the chat. We feel it's important to keep this in mind and to think about and know and honor the land that we're on. And the ICN, the Inter-Council Network, covers, works with many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities throughout Canada. Pour ceux qui sont nouveaux au réseau des conseils, le réseau de coordination des conseils est une coalition qui regroupe les 8 conseils provinciaux et régionaux pour la coopération internationale. Ces conseils et leurs organisations membres luttent pour la promotion de la justice sociale et du changement social à travers le monde. Ils représentent plus de 350 organisations de la société civile diverses et réparties à travers le Canada. Le réseau offre une plateforme nationale qui permet au Conseil de collaborer ensemble pour améliorer leur efficacité et identifier les priorités communes et en matière d'action collective. Enracinés dans les communautés à travers le Canada, nous sommes des leaders dans l'engagement du public au niveau local et régional, et nous sommes reconnus pour notre capacité à porter les connaissances et les priorités régionales au niveau national. Alors, nous sommes basés à Halifax dans le Conseil Atlantique pour la coopération internationale. Et cet webinaire est un de nos plusieurs programmes que nous offrons. Alors, nous sommes très, très contents d'avoir les panélistes ici aujourd'hui et tout le monde qui est présent. Alors, je vais maintenant passer la parole à mon collègue, Tina Renier, qui va introduire notre animatrice et nos panélistes. Alors, bienvenue et merci tout le monde.
Hello, everyone. I'll be introducing today's moderator. Sinethemba Dlamini is a broadcast journalist from the Kingdom of Eswatini. She has a rich background in public relations, having worked as a stakeholder relations officer for 2 advertising agencies, which sparked her love for corporate communications. She's a firm believer in equality and information as a tool for positive change. She has joined the NGO sector where her love and fire for women and children have led her to lead the first national campaign on the 16 days against gender-based violence, where she learned about the rights of women and children amidst the glaring reality of gender-based violence across the board. She is also a news reporter and news anchor for the national broadcaster. Her heart remains rooted in the issues of women, children, HIV/AIDS, and education. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Sinethemba Dlamini.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Tina. It is such an honor for me to be part of what I believe is a timely conversation on how we all have been forced to rethink, re-strategize and adapt to the changes brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. I know that as a journalist working in Africa, Eswatini in particular, I have been forced to adapt to what I believe is going to be the next normal. As a national broadcaster, my work is similar in many ways to that being done by nonprofit organizations, in the sense that I too need to go into these communities, often comprised of people who are either marginalized or previously disadvantaged in one or multiple ways. That is why this conversation is so important for us to be having a conversation of this nature right now. We need to collectively decide how, in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic, we ensure that there is continuity of conversation. With lockdowns all over the world and a justified sense of uncertainty, more people are looking online for voices that they can trust on what next to do. That is where the nonprofit sector comes in, because they all can trust the integrity with which these organizations were founded and are being run. This, however, begs the question then, therefore, how do we ensure that as we are transitioning, that no one is left behind? It is in that same spirit that it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel of experts today, who will shed some much needed light. On our panel today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce, all the way from South America, a man whose research interests include homophobia, human rights, gender, vulnerability, sexual health, stigma, and discrimination. Joel Simpson is the founder and the co-chairperson of the Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, SASOD, in Guyana. He has worked extensively, even with the United Nations, as the Human Rights Associate at the United Nations Development Program, popularly known as UNDP, country office in Guyana. A chevening scholar with a Master of Laws degree in Human Rights Law from the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom. He's also a member of the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender and Intersex Law Association, amongst many other regional and international affiliations. If I were to literally go through his CVs, we would focus on that just alone. So hi, Joel, and welcome. Also, we have on our panel, Lesley, who is currently the youth advocate with the Ontario Council for International Cooperation's Youth Policy Makers Hub. Lesley has spent a generous amount of time engaging in initiatives using an anti-oppressive and intersectional framework to spread awareness to issues she's passionate about. Born and raised in Toronto, Lesley has always been passionate about mental health, advocacy, youth and gender empowerment and equality, and anti-racism work in her communities. Lesley is part of the class of 2020 at Brock University, where she received a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Women and Gender Studies to expand her capacity in various spaces. Next up is Sydney Piggott, who wears many hats as a civil society leader, a researcher and advocate for gender equity and inclusion on a global scale. At YWCA Canada, she leads impact-driven initiatives with a vision to see women and girls empowered in a safe and equitable society. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that she is passionate about the power of young people, which is why she also works with several youth organizations locally, nationally, and globally. She brings in an intersectional feminist lens to all of her work, informed by her proud Afro-Caribbean heritage. She holds a Master of Global Affairs from the University of Toronto, Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, where she co-founded the Intersectional Feminist Collective, and a bachelor's degree in International Development Studies from McGill University. And lastly, but by no means least, we have on our panel of experts, Shaelyn. Shaelyn's family is from Temiskaming, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, First Nation and of European descent. Separated from her family on the reservation caused by the legacy of residential schools, she grew up in Rama First Nation. Learning her Indigenous history, culture, and a bit of the language has led her into the nonprofit sector, where she feels she can really make a difference and help amplify the voices of Indigenous peoples for social and environmental justice, which are inextricably linked. She currently holds two positions at the Kawatha World Issues Center as the Office and Outreach Coordinator, as well as the Project Coordinator for a YWCA project called Advancing the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 Agenda. She studied at Trent University and received her BA in Indigenous Studies and Philosophy. So that's everyone who's on our panel today. First up is going to be Sydney. We are encouraging all of our panelists to please do join in the conversation, add your comments and questions as well, and we promise to take those as we go along. At this time, I'm going to hand the microphone over to the very capable hands of Miss Sydney Piggott.
Thank you so much, Sinethemba, for the kind introduction, and thanks to everyone for being part of this discussion. Je vais faire ma présentation en anglais, mais je suis contente de répondre à des questions soit en français ou en anglais pendant la période de questions. Donc, n'hésitez pas de demander vos questions soit en anglais ou en français. I'm joining you from Toronto, which is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation on public engagement and global citizenship education with these awesome, incredible panelists, both because of the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also, which I think is really important, is the context and the rise of activism against state violence against Black and Indigenous people and people with mental health issues across Turtle Island, but what you may know as North America. As you can tell from my bio, I work in the gender equity and gender inclusion space with a lot of local organizations, but also with national and international organizations. So I'm approaching this conversation, as was mentioned before, from an intersectional feminist perspective. And before I kind of get into what this discussion is about, I really think it's important to talk about intersectionality, because lately I've heard the term used a lot, but I don't totally think that it's centering the experiences of Black women who informed and created this theory. So I think it's really important that we give credit where credit is due in terms of this discussion. And I really hope that this is something that you'll carry forward with you in your conversations around public engagement and around global citizenship education during the pandemic. So Dr. Kimberlé Crenshaw, who is a self-proclaimed feminist and critical race theorist, coined the term intersectionality based on her lived experience as a Black woman in the US, but also based on the experiences of other Black women. And it's specifically in response to the simultaneous experiences of discrimination that Black women face, both because of their race and their gender. I think that this is really important to talk about because it talks about a society, a context in the US, but also here in Canada and many places in the world where whiteness and masculinity is valued over other identities. So her earlier work really talked about gender-based violence and experiences of discrimination in employment. But as this theory evolved and started to include kind of different narratives of different communities, it went beyond talking about race and gender and really started to talk about multiple aspects of our identities that become marginalized in different forms of societies that exist. So this could be sexuality, ability, class, other issues, other identities that many of you may hold. So I think it's really important to talk about that. And I think what's really important for this conversation is that Dr. Crenshaw says that intersectionality is really a framework for understanding the multiple layers of social injustice and the ways in which our identities affect both our experiences of discrimination, but also our experiences of privilege, which I think is a conversation that we've been having a lot in these spaces. And I think it's really important to reflect on. And the reason that intersectionality is so important to me and why my feminism is intersectional is because it's a theory that's dynamic. It evolves and it changes, and it really takes into account a lot of different ways in which our social locations, our identities change in different contexts. So if you want to learn more about this, that's kind of all I'll say for now, but I really encourage you to listen to Dr. Crenshaw's TED Talk from 2016. In fact, because the examples that she uses in that TED Talk are of police violence against Black communities and the ways that women are not really centered in those conversations. And I think right now, that's incredibly important because Black women and especially Black trans women in this movement are really being excluded. So I highly encourage you to look into that and take a look after this if you haven't. And with all that said, what does it have to do with global citizenship, education, and public engagement? I think that this pandemic has taught us that borders are totally fake. Coronavirus, she doesn't care about the borders. She's going everywhere she pleases. She's affecting everybody. I think it really recognizes that we are part of a global community, and things that affect one of us affect all of us. If it's a pandemic, climate change, global inequities related to gender, related to race, sexuality, ability, they really affect all of us. But it's also made it clear that they don't affect us all equally. And there are really deep inequities in our societies that make it much harder for people in this pandemic to engage in these types of public spaces, whether they're online or in person. Women, girls, and non-binary people are some of those groups, but there really are many. So as we shift the way that we do public engagement and global citizenship education, I think that we really have to think about how these online spaces perpetuate those inequities. And actually, Dr. Crenshaw warns against something she calls trickle-down approaches to social justice, which I think is a really interesting concept. It comes from what you probably heard, Reaganomics or trickle-down economics, that basically is a widely disproven theory that if you award more privilege to the already privileged, that somehow that wealth and that privilege will trickle down through the social hierarchy to benefit everyone. And we know that that's totally not true, but I think it's really important to think about that in the context of this conversation, because a lot of people, a lot of organizations, a lot of institutions have really talked about the benefits and the opportunities of doing this work online. Think of things like it's costs less to have it happen online, whether it's a program, a conference, a course, any kind of delivery of programming happening online is less expensive for the people delivering it in some ways. In a lot of ways, people see it as greater engagement because there are more numbers, so more physical people that you can count attending your events because they're happening online. And a lot of the times this is because people either are looking for things to do or they're able to better access it from home. Physical accessibility for some people is improved by having these spaces happen online. And I think that this is something that the disability justice movement has been talking about. So it's great to see us moving towards it, but how do we do this better? How do we center those voices in this conversation? It's also reduced some barriers to access for these opportunities, especially for global opportunities, because when they're made available online at a lower cost or even at no cost, people are able to attend and be in spaces that they maybe weren't able to be in before. We also have less restriction in terms of borders and time zones because we're able to access these from home or from different environments. And I think that that's totally valid. I know even in the programs I've been running, whether it's a workshop for youth in Toronto or a national conversation with a feminist leader, or if it's a global consultation on kind of the effects of COVID-19 for women and girls, I definitely feel like more people are showing up. I feel like more people are being involved in these discussions, and I think that that's absolutely great. But what I continue to ask myself is who's not able to be here, and how are the existing gaps that we're experiencing in physical spaces being made wider because of our current context? And I'm choosing one example to kind of illustrate this, but there really are many. And the example that I've chosen to talk about is internet access. So who has access to internet access? And I've kind of looked at this from a local perspective and then bringing it out to the global. So I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit of a picture of what internet access looks like on a global scale for different communities. So I live, like I mentioned, in Toronto. And here for low-income communities, it can cost up to 10% of their annual income for phone and internet services. And a great organization called The Color of Poverty, Color of Change has found multiple times that low-income communities here are largely racialized communities, overwhelmingly so. So those are Black communities, Indigenous communities, and people of color. Then if you look at Canada more broadly, only 36% of rural communities have access to high-speed internet, and only 24% of Indigenous communities have access to high-speed internet, which is, you know, shocking, I think, for a country that claims to be an affluent democracy, claims to be a place that values equity. I think it's totally unacceptable from my opinion, and you think of who's being excluded in those conversations. In the US, Black households are 13% less likely to have an internet connection at home compared to white households. That was research done by the Pew Research Center, and they look into it by race-based data, gender, age. It's really interesting. I highly recommend you take a look. The Web Foundation found that globally, men are 21% more likely to use the internet, and in least developed countries, they're 52% more likely to use the internet than women. So now imagine if you have two or more of those identities. Imagine if you're experiencing these barriers from multiple levels. how likely are you to be able to show up in a digital space, in an online space, and be able to participate openly and freely? And internet access, like I said, is just one example that I use to kind of demonstrate this divide, but there are so many that we're seeing during this pandemic. There's being at increased risks of gender-based violence because you're at home with an abuser. It's not being able to have assistive technologies for hearing or seeing or understanding online video forums. It's not having access to a computer or tablet. I know it, especially in my global work with some of the international organizations I work with, many people are accessing these spaces from a smartphone, and think of how difficult it is to be able to do that and be able to engage fully when you don't have the technology that you need. Things like not having a fixed address, being homeless, and not having access to public services like libraries and schools where you ordinarily would have been able to access the internet or be in these spaces. And for youth, not having access to meal programs or other social supports that come from being in a community center or being in a school environment. These are all kind of the barriers that I think of when we're asking who is here, especially when I'm talking about youth work and specifically kind of working with communities that are made vulnerable in the different societies that we work in. And I think that this is where the intersectionality question comes in. These are just naming a list of barriers, but often these barriers are being experienced at the same time by one individual. So how are we making sure that these spaces are safer? And I'll give a personal example. I'm someone who is incredibly privileged, despite what people want to tell me. I know that on the outside, you know, I'm a woman, I'm Black, I'm part of the queer community as well, but you know, I'm fair-skinned, I'm able-bodied, I'm educated, I'm able to continue to work from home. I have an incredibly supportive family and friend group that kind of keeps me going. But, you know, the last month, the last 6 weeks have been incredibly hard for the Black community. You know, our social media feeds are being filled with images, graphic images of anti-Black racism. And for me, one of those images is from literally 2 blocks away from where I live. So the last thing that I want to do is engage online. I don't want to be online. It's not a safe space for me. But, you know, this is where my work was happening. This is where my social engagements were happening. This is where my whole life was happening as a result of this pandemic. So I really had to put in the work to create this space that was safe for me. And sometimes that meant just tuning out. So I'm just thinking of other Black youth who are working in these spaces and what they need to be able to access this. I think that it's really important to center those conversations. It's something I'm constantly thinking of when I'm doing this work, whether it's public engagement, global citizenship education, having small workshops with just 5 people or huge events with, you know, hundreds of people. It's just something that I think is really important to think about. And really to understand how the intersections of our identities affect our ability to fully bring ourselves to these spaces. So this particular moment in history, I think, is unique. It's going to cause a whole paradigm shift. And as Sinethemba was saying, we have a completely new normal to recreate after this. So I really hope that those barriers will kind of be at the top of mind when we think about this. But I really do want to end on a hopeful note and some of the interesting solutions that I've seen to reducing these barriers to inclusion and making these spaces safer and more secure for women, girls, and non-binary people of various identities. And I'm going to give a few concrete examples that I've either seen or that I've used myself that I found were really interesting. So one of those is the Community Foundations of Canada and Youthful Cities is hosting a conference with RBC shortly. And it will not only pay youth to be able to participate, but will also provide a stipend for internet access, which I think is an incredible way to really be investing in people who are not having access to these spaces. How do we provide the resources, whether it's access to internet, to phone, to equipment, to be able to participate in these conversations, in this work, in this education that we're providing? An organization that I work with called Apathy is Boring. I'm a mentor with their RISE program. They provide Uber Eats gift cards or other gift cards for food so that the youth participating in their programs have a meal during these discussions. Because if we were having them in person, we would have had food, we would have had water, we would have had other things. And this is something I actually tested in my own organization because I was so inspired by it, and it's a great idea. So I really encourage people to think about how you can reduce barriers in terms of those activities. World YWCA, which is the international body of YWCA, and YWCA Canada is part of that group. I work with them quite closely on a number of things, and they've created a virtual safe space guide. So it's a guide to help facilitate online discussions in a variety of contexts. I facilitated one a couple months ago with the French caucus, or the French group of World YWCA. So we had a lot of people from Europe, but many people from sub-Saharan Africa and Francophone African countries. And we were able to kind of have this discussion where people are coming from very different levels of privilege, very different experiences. And the guide really helped us to move through this digital space in a way that was safe for everybody. And I highly recommend you either create those safe space guidelines or use these types of resources to make sure that these online spaces are safe. Another cool thing that I've noticed is that video conferencing platforms like Zoom and Teams are starting to incorporate closed captioning capabilities to make these spaces more physically accessible for people either who are hard of hearing or on the autism spectrum, to be able to better understand these types of online conversations. I know for me, I always have closed captioning on. So one of the things that is sometimes challenging for these spaces is not being able to fully grasp the conversation because they don't exist. So it's really cool to see these companies evolving and taking that into account when it comes to accessibility. And finally, a resource from Canadian Women's Foundation that you may have seen is the Signal for Help resource, which is basically some signals that you can use on a video chat or in remote work situations to be able to indicate that there's an abuser in your home or you're experiencing gender-based violence while you're working remotely. It was circulated to be able to help women, girls, and non-binary people to signal for help in a way that felt safe for them. And I think that this is a great tool to be able to make sure that these spaces are accessible for people and that they're safe for people. Those are just a few of the ones I've come across in my work, but there's lots of innovative solutions that are coming out of the grassroots and other civil society organizations. And even if we're not quite where we need to be, I think that we're making really interesting changes and really thinking critically about these inequities and the spaces that we're creating as we do this public engagement and global citizenship work online. I think that digital spaces ultimately are just recreations of our physical spaces. So to think that these inequities don't exist online, I think is naive. I really think that we need to make the same concerted effort that we make in real life, in digital life, because those inequities will continue to exist. They're created within a society that is inequitable. So I think it's something to really be mindful of. How are we dismantling these systems that discriminate against women, against gender diverse people, against Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people with disabilities, struggling with mental illness. There's queer communities, low-income communities. So many people are still being left behind. And I know that I've been grappling with this so much in the last few months as I try to transform these digital spaces. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say, and the people listening, what solutions have worked for you. I'm so curious to know. I think it's a really great opportunity to really build these spaces in the image of the world that we want to see when this pandemic ends. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sydney. I think for me, a powerful takeaway from your presentation right now was how we need to think about how these online spaces are actually widening the gaps as opposed to closing the divide. Who has access to the internet? What is the likelihood of the people that we're trying to reach being able to participate in conversations such as the conversation that we're having this evening, my time, today on your end of the world. Up next, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Joelle.
Need to unmute. Thank you, Sydney, for a very good presentation. I'm surprised how much I might sound like if I'm trying to echo that. Good day, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm joining you from Georgetown, Guyana in South America. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the changing context of public engagement from a Global South perspective. To understand that context, I'm going to share a little bit about where I am in the Global South, because I think the situation in the Caribbean is going to be different for the situation in Africa, vis-a-vis the situation in Asia and other parts of the Global South and East. So Guyana is seated in South America, with cultural and political ties to the Caribbean, being the only English-speaking country on the continent. In our context, pre-COVID-19, we're classified as a developing country, and that comes with certain characteristics. limited access to the internet and poor quality internet generally in the country. So for instance, internet penetration in Guyana is only 52%. And to understand that, what that means in the Guyanese context, we're a country of about 750,000 people. The country is 82,000 square miles, and about 70% of the country is uninhabited. Most of the country is rainforest. So you're really talking about people who are in pockets or enclaves in largely urban settings, and less or so in pockets or smaller enclaves in rural settings. So for Georgetown, which is seated in Region 4, in the US context, you might call it a state, or in the Canadian context, you might call it a province. And half of the population lives, over half of the population lives in this capital region, which is considered urban. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what the Guyanese developing or global south context is. There's also pre-COVID, there was also high unemployment, underemployment, and high levels of poverty. Some towns in Guyana report as high as 40% youth unemployment, for instance. So a very challenging context. So with that, marginalized communities that I work with at SASO Guyana, LGBTQ communities and other vulnerable groups are facing multiple intersectional challenges, and poverty is a common thread. So in addition to dealing with socioeconomic and sociocultural marginalization and discrimination, people have less access to resources and are dealing with the daily challenges related to poverty in the country. And then came COVID-19. We confirmed our first case on March 11th in Guyana, and the context has certainly changed a lot. We have just completed a cross-sectional quantitative survey about how the impact of COVID-19 on LGBT communities in Guyana. And I want to share with you some very quick findings so you could understand the changing context a little bit more. We had 265 respondents to a survey which was online via SurveyMonkey. And we provided incentives of phone cards valued $10 US in local currency for the first 150 respondents. So we had a very good response rate thanks to the incentives. And we had about 45% men who responded, 30% women, and 25% trans, gender non-conforming, and non-binary people. Some of the interesting findings, which certainly change our context, are that over 70% of persons who responded to our survey said they had either lost jobs or had experienced reduced working hours, and they had very little current savings. Pre-COVID-19, persons said that the most requested service, or the service that they utilized the most from LGBTQ organizations especially, was mental health counseling. And now with COVID-19, persons felt their needs were mostly for food. A lot of people are facing food insecurity in our communities, and also continued psychosocial support to help to deal with emotions and stress related to the pandemic. Another interesting finding for the context of working online is that most people from our communities were saying that they get their information related to COVID-19 and virtually anything else on social media and not from the mainstream media. So I like to think that the context has provided us with some pros and some cons. And I want to kind of look at it, I want to flip-flop a bit and look at the pros and cons as two sides of a coin. So like Sydney said, it was my first bullet on this, that there certainly is a lower cost for the host of virtual engagements, online platforms to be able to do this kind of work. If we were hosting an in-person workshop, you would be bringing people together, bringing them from multiple regions, In Guyana, some people might be traveling for hours to get to the capital district by boat, over land, and all of that. And some people would travel so far for a national workshop that you be required to put them in a local hotel for the duration that they would be staying there if it's a multi-day workshop. Because especially if they're traveling back by boat, the boats in the local rivers don't travel after dark. So certainly lower costs. But the flip side for that is the limited internet penetration, and the internet access in the rural areas is so limited, and the quality is so poor that it really does limit participation to a largely urban-based constituency. So that presents another barrier from involving and working with rural communities and indigenous communities, especially in the Guyanese context, where our indigenous populations live closer to the Amazon, in the interior regions, and not on the coast where our capital is located. We have found, and we've just tested just last week, so the webinar is timely, doing virtual training online. And we did a legal literacy training, which we normally do in person, and it usually takes 2 days annually between 2017 and 2019. This year, for the first time, because of the pandemic, we've had to do it online. And what we found is that less people showed up. We had less people than we were trying to, we decided we won't work with more than 15 people, being the first time online and given that it was a training. And we had about 14 that registered and about 9 persons who we could say have completed the training. So less people showed up, and I think the downside to that we discovered is that when people are in their offices at other NGOs, other agencies, they're still consumed by the other work that's going on in the office, so they easily get distracted or pulled away to work on something else. In the Guyanese context, civil society organizations are very under-resourced. So one person is doing like 5 persons' jobs, and that's no exaggeration. And that's the case generally in civil society in Guyana. So it's very hard if you don't get people out of their offices and in a physical space where you have their exclusive attention to sustain that kind of interest. So unlike other places where more people are showing up and that sort of thing, and reaching more people, that's not the case for Guyana in our Global South context, at least. But what we did find, using the same example of the virtual training we did last week, is that we were also attracting a slightly different demographic, even from other civil society organizations and other communities. The persons who are staff at organizations in the offices at civil society groups found it difficult to engage completely with the online training because of the distractions of the workplace. But the volunteers who might be home, unemployed, underemployed, at school, on school break and so on, were actually the representatives that were able to participate fully. And that was very interesting for us, and we're still processing this experience, because the persons are often on the front lines are the ones who've been to the trainings in 2017 to 2019. So you're able to reach different persons, even within the same communities. So that's something we need to distill a little bit more, having just completed the training. For us as facilitators and trainers on the other end, it really pressures us to be a lot more creative and dynamic with how we do training and how we engage online. Because if you were in in-person workshop settings, there is so much that you can do in terms of practical work, practical exercises to really get lessons across that are not so easy to do in an online setting. So it's certainly a lot more challenging for the facilitation and the trainer. And this is from preparation to execution that I found. I found that I spent so much time trying to transform a curriculum that we've used for 3 years just on the basis that we were doing it online for the first time. And it took so much time and so much resources out of our office to transform this training to an online program. I think also with virtual online engagements, especially when they're a little bit longer than a webinar, we're all speaking here for like an hour and a half, but we had sessions last week where presentations went for about 2 hours, and then there were practical tutorials in the afternoon, late in the afternoon, for another 2 hours. And because it was a legal literacy training, we had practical problems that participants had to address and solve and determine how they would look at them if they came before them in their organizational context. We found that the dynamic of your PowerPoints and all of that and so on online is a little bit more biased to persons who are at a certain literacy level. And if you're working with marginalized communities, persons from LGBTQ persons who might have faced transphobic and homophobic bullying at school, didn't get to complete school, and the literacy levels are not as high, then online could be challenging if you don't find very creative ways to deliver that content besides the PowerPoint presentation, which we become so accustomed to in our professional world. Another good thing, and this relates to the cost as well, but also time as a resource, is that online and virtual platforms and engagements eliminate the need for travel and local travel. And in the Guyanese context, that's such a big deal because people coming from the interior regions would have to travel for so long. So for instance, our southernmost town in the interior in Letem, it would take 12 hours by bus to get to the capital city, Georgetown. And that return trip would cost at least $100 US just by bus. If somebody was to try to fly by plane, which would be under 2 hours, the return flight would be no less than $300 US. So eliminating that cost and that time for local travel is great. But the flip side to that is that those persons, like Sydney also mentioned in her presentation, would have to be equipped with the necessary technology to be able to participate online. You would also have to provide, in the context with the high poverty, under-resourced civil society, and you're working with marginalized groups. And then let's not forget in the LGBTQ context, I mentioned that over 70% of persons said they've lost jobs or lost or significantly reduced hours at their work. You'd also have to provide the means to join the training, so mobile data as well. In a project that we're hoping to start soon, we're going to be experimenting with providing LGBTQ persons, particularly trans and gender non-conforming persons, with phablets on loan to be able to participate in virtual training, and with mobile data and phone cards and things like that to be able to participate in the trainings online. So I'm hoping that there will be a good lesson to share where that's concerned. The other thing about the new normal of having to work and virtually and mostly online is that working in person, training, engaging with groups in person, you're allowed to bring lessons that aren't necessarily just so didactic, like me telling you what it is or what to do. Training now online, we found, can take a little bit longer because you can't do as many practical lessons in the way that you would in the workshop setting to get your point across. So the legal literacy training that we would usually do in about 2 working days, the hours that we've spent on it over the past week would amount to about 3 working days to get the same level of understanding and all of that we hope to achieve through our sensitization, through our training across the participants. So the new normal is still quite relatively new, but I think there are a couple of promising practices. I don't like saying best practices because, you know, there's always something better than you currently have. And it's too early for me to call it a good practice, but I'm seeing some promise with some of them. And I wanted to share some of those early lessons where that's concerned. I think in our context where a lot of people might be using social media to get information, for those of us doing work around education, any kind of education, sensitization, whether it's for the public or in some cases it's for groups which are a significant number and can be found in the public domain. Social media provides a great opportunity for that kind of public education. And especially now, the pandemic has reinforced that a lot of people are turning to social media for their information. So it's certainly a lot cheaper to advertise, broadcast your messages on social media than it is to do that on the mainstream media through television ads and radio adverts and things like that. So I think that's an opportunity that we can capitalize on, and certainly the results of our survey reinforce that a lot of people are looking on social media for their information, including information about the pandemic. The devices on loan could be a good way to bridge the technological gap, and it makes it sustainable. You certainly can't give everybody a smartphone or a laptop every time you need to do a training, but maybe going for a phablet across between a tablet and a phone, and just doing it on loan for the period of the training, lower costs, keeping those devices serviced and so on. And our ICT support firm is able to put a tracking device on it, so you can tell where it is if it gets lost. You can also limit what a participant might be able to do on it, so they can only use certain kinds of programs and so on. So there's less exposure to internet viruses and things like that and so on. So I think that is a promising practice, and if those phablets or those devices can last for a number of years, it might be the way to go in the context. For us in the Caribbean, the director of PAHO is advising countries in the region to prepare to deal with COVID-19 for the next 2 years at least. Because I think in a developing global south context, we are very aware that even if an effective treatment or a vaccine comes to the fore in 6 months, in 9 months, it's going to take a while before it reaches the global south. And you know, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And the region and Guyana, we're preparing to deal with that context, that we will be restricted about what we can do, maybe for another 2 years, even if there's a breakthrough in 2021. The other good practice, promising practice, some of the savings that we've gotten from not having to do the workshop catering and all the food that we go to and consume at these trainings when we go to hotels and that sort of thing. Those resources could and really should be directed to provide food supplies, grocery hampers, personal hygiene and cleaning supplies for those marginalized groups that we're working with, especially in a context where we might be asking persons to spend more time online doing a training in job readiness, work readiness, and so on. Those persons are giving up time that they could spend looking for a job or doing something else that can generate incomes and livelihoods. So I think organizations which are working for equity and fairness and so on should consider providing those kinds of basic items for persons when they're doing online trainings and things like that. I think I'm going to stop there and chip in a little bit more during the Q&A on some of this.
Thanks, Joelle. I think for me, what really hit home with your presentation is what the COVID-19 pandemic basically did was to just lift the veil over already existing challenges and compounding those even further. I mean, when we speak about scarcity of resources, high levels of unemployment, I'm coming from a country where the poverty line is currently at over 68% of the people in the Kingdom of Eswatini, for instance, are living below the poverty line. And then now also the opportunity that is being presented now during the COVID-19 pandemic to leverage on the power of social media. I think that gives us a responsibility as the nonprofit sector to actually go and literally invade these spaces with proper information, because the people who are spending a lot of time online are heavily reliant on the kind of information that they're getting on social media, especially because also they have a lot of time on their hands right now. I really like what you said as well about the early lessons, the potential that is there on social media, as well as some of the interventions that we could potentially be exploring. Lesley, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you so much, Sinethemba, for the introduction. And thank you so much to the ICN for giving me the opportunity to be on this panel today with brilliant people who inspire me with their work and their expertise. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional territory that I am on as land that is not my own, but land of the First Nations, Inuits, and Métis people. And I'm happy to be here today with everybody to share my experiences as somebody who is starting to engage in the not-for-profit sector at a full capacity as a young person. And I think it's important that I share my perspective on youth engagement and what that has been like for the past 3 to 4 months, given that life as we know it has really taken a different approach. So my interest in public engagement really started around my 3rd year of university. And as a young Black woman who has experienced systemic oppression, including anti-Black racism and misogyny, both inside and outside of the academic spaces, I sought to learn the discourse to try to understand why my experience is my experience and the experiences of several others. And within this, I look to see how I was able to get involved in several spaces where I can be able to share my experiences, unpack the trauma, and heal, while utilizing my strengths as an individual, being an effective communicator and engaging listener to those who deserve to also have their stories be heard in order to influence change and address these issues. I've been privileged to have access to an education, and I spent my entire life in the classroom. And I believe that every day is a teachable moment, and every experience is an opportunity for learning, more importantly, as a young person. And one thing that I really want to share is that, and acknowledge, is that youth engagement goes beyond the educational capacity. We really need to keep in mind that although education should be a right, it is a privilege to many. And when we talk about addressing various barriers, including systemic oppression towards marginalized communities, we often discuss using theoretical frameworks to address this. As Sini has brilliantly discussed with us earlier, the use of various theories such as intersectionality, different feminist frameworks, queer theory, critical race theory, and indigenous methodology. These are just a few from the lot. I do want to express that theory is versatile, and many of these theories, as mentioned earlier, has been developed through the lived experience. And I think that is very critical when it comes to youth engagement. And I believe in people, young people in all walks of life are deserving of being in spaces where they can be heard, empowered, and to engage in a world and to be in the change that the world desperately needs. And making this theory accessible in this sense creates the power of youth engagement, which is about empowering all young people as valuable partners in addressing and making decisions about issues that they believe is important and issues that affect them in any way. Now, it's really important to have young people engaged because it allows room for innovation. And especially at a time as such, encouraging representation among diverse youth allows perspectives that help us shape the way we address various issues. It is a perfect opportunity for us to be further involved in decision-making processes on policies that are most likely going to impact us, especially during a time of COVID-19, especially during a time of a revolution. We are the ones who are going to be severely impacted, if not already. And the primary goal of having us involved is to ensure that our voices are priority. Now, I do want to share a little bit about my experiences with youth engagement, just getting my foot in the door, and my experiences with OCIC and how that has really changed my perspective on youth engagement and how that has expanded my capacity. So I want to just touch upon what the Youth Policy Makers Hub does. And they encourage learning and community engagement across Ontario. And they are designed to enable multi-sectoral dialogue and acknowledge exchange to advance inclusion, gender equality, and sustainable development. For the sake of time, if you do want to learn more about OCIC and their YPH hub, or our several hubs such as our gender equality hub, you can check out our website or our social media platforms as well. Now, with COVID-19 changing the scope of how we engage, OCIC has worked hard to ensure that our hubs remain involved and encourage youth engagement and capacity building within and outside of our networks. As mentioned earlier, online engagement has given us an opportunity to engage and participate in several learning opportunities, along with speaking engagements that allows for the sharing of our experiences and expertise. And a lot of this has happened with many of our anticipated in-person events moving online, such as our advocacy boot camps with Results Canada, our CCIC participation forum, and webinars that include, or that helps us, I should say, with our professional and personal development. And with the Youth Policy Hub, our youth advocates have been able to initiate several community projects that aim to address the needs of young people, whether it be through education, awareness, and discussing and executing action plans. And with the great support of our allies, they have provided us with resources and opportunities that really best fit our needs and interests, and that helps us engage within our capacity and possibly expand beyond that. I can attest to having Sydney here on this panel as one of our allies, and she has been amazing, and she's been really helpful with allowing us to be in that space. So obviously with COVID-19 comes many challenges. I can echo several of them that has been mentioned earlier by Sydney and by Joel. And things are obviously different now and unexpected, and that can cause a lot of tension within our own networks, within non-for-profit organizations as well. Just trying to figure out how we can move forward with our new normal. And with these challenges, some of them I will share will be a bit subjective based off of my experience, but acknowledging that we are currently in a pandemic, and this is a traumatic time for a lot of people, including myself, just trying to figure out where we can move forward and how we can move forward with these transitions, especially during these times of revolution. We are experiencing a lot. We are exposed to a lot more than we thought that we would be, and it has been very difficult. But how do we continue to engage if we are able to? And a challenge with that, especially with everything transitioning to a virtual world, is just figuring out where to start and keeping up with forums and programs and webinars and engagement opportunities. It can get a little bit up to our noses, and especially since we're being pushed into this new normal, that can definitely be a challenge. And just to echo the sentiment of accessibility, with the shift in programming, conferences and events and webinars going online, it could be a barrier for many accessing the internet, accessing that technology, accessing the space. I'm just going to echo again Sydney and Joel's points of having safe spaces and having access to that opportunity. And also, in doing so, it's really important to address, to use an intersectional lens to address these barriers for this challenge. So some of the solutions that I thought of, or I have really been applying to the challenges that I've been facing as a young person engaging in this space and wanting to continue to engage. Again, these are subjective, but these are doable, especially during these times. I think my primary solution would be to not be afraid to speak up. As a young person witnessing these revolutionary times, we have been shown that nothing gets done unless we use our voice. And as a young person, we have that capability. Many of us have that capability to speak up for those who cannot. And within our own capacity in finding ways to engage, being a young person, we can express what we bring to the table. I think we should never limit ourselves. This includes our strengths, our expertise, our weaknesses even, and our recommendations. Even if it is just our experiences that we are comfortable sharing within our capacity, it is more than enough to influence change within the spaces and outside of the spaces that we're involved in. I think it's really also important as a young person to express our interest in learning. As I mentioned earlier, everything is a teachable moment, and this can really help us to establish and expand our ways of knowing, our expertise, and also gives us an opportunity to unlearn as well. And one thing that I also want to share with everybody is that while doing this, especially during the times of COVID-19, a lot of this can be overwhelming, especially walking into this space. We think we could tackle on a lot of things, but we also need to keep in mind that we are one person and we're still young. And as much as we want to, we can't change the world by ourselves, and this is a collective effort. So we have to be kind to ourselves during this time, and while doing so, we can be able to work within or strengthen our capacity to continue to engage. And I would also like to share some possible recommendations for organizations that are probably tuning in that encourage youth engagement. When organizations invest in young people, they are investing in an opportunity to growth within their own organization. And you are investing in future leaders. And I think that is the end goal, especially when it comes to addressing various issues and barriers that has arisen during the times of COVID-19, even before then. And some recommendations as a young person that has been engaging in these spaces. I believe that organizations should not be scared to engage youth, to really put them at the forefront if they are comfortable doing so. We as young people are the people that needs to be heard. And organizations should use this as a learning opportunity to promote possible changes within the organization for young people to better adapt. And as young people, we are currently in need of support. So this means that organizations should invest in us through accessibility, as mentioned earlier, so that we can have the opportunity to fully engage to the best of our ability. And also ask us questions as we have conversations or initiate conversations. Have conversations with us. Ask us how can I help you be the best leader that you can be as a young person. And also we encourage you to connect us with other organizations that would love to have us involved in any outside initiatives that can help expand our capacity. And I just bring this up because of my experiences with the OCIC and how they have really helped me in expanding my network and expanding my capability to engage with other networks and establish those connections so that I can work within that range in addressing various issues that are important to me and to the people around me. And So those are just some of the solutions. Again, these are subjective, and I know that there are many more. And I would like to also take this opportunity to invite everybody that's participating to share any methods of public engagement and capacity building. And please do so by sharing any suggestions you may have in the chat box. Like I said, this is also a learning experience for myself, and I'm sure for my fellow panelists. And I would love for us to be exposed to the opportunities that encourages civic engagement as a young population. So I do want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to my perspective as a young person, taking up this space as I believe that I can play a significant part in the change that I want to see. And I encourage all the young people that are on this panel to play a part if they can, because no role is too small. Thank you.
No role is too small. Thank you so very much, Lesley. Some of the things that resonated and hit home with me during your presentation was how educational law is a right. It sadly remains a privilege for many young people. And also you spoke a lot about how young people engagement allows and creates room for innovation, something that we really need right now, because the truth is that we literally have had the rug pulled from under our feet. Therefore, we cannot afford to be dogmatic. We cannot afford to do business as usual, as it were. And also when we have policies that young people can relate to, the likelihood is that they will be eager to participate, which is so very important right now. And at this point, I'm going to hand over the microphone, so to speak, to Shaelyn.
Anin Bojo, Shaelyn Wabegijijg, Indigenous, Ermine Temiskaming and Don Jaba, Atik and Dodem. So I introduced myself in Anishinaabe because that is a really healing practice for me, learning my language, speaking my language. It grounds me and it connects me to the 7 generations that came before me and will come after me. So right now I'm in Nogo-Jiwanong, Peterborough. We reside under the Williams Treaty and Treaty 20. Those are very destructive treaties to our ways of life. So just acknowledging that history. Chimigwech to the organizers, to the ICN, to the panelists, especially everyone who made this a reality. I just want to thank the speakers for sharing all of your insights, those facts, those experiences. Like, they're so valuable, and I love this conversation, and I hope I can add some things to it. But I just want to acknowledge that, like, Indigenous peoples in Canada are so diverse. And, you know, I can only speak to my experiences and what I've learned so far. Also speaking from an Anishinaabe perspective, within that there's even, you know, the Chippewa, the Ojibwe, the Algonquin. I'm Algonquin. I spent a lot of time with Chippewa and Ojibwe, so I've learned from them, and, you know, I'm learning every day. And please, I'm open to any feedback, any follow-up. If you just search my name, you can find me on the platforms. Yeah, let's dive into it. So, you know, my experiences growing up in Rama First Nation, frequently visiting Curve Lake and Kettle Point First Nation, basically, that's where my experience comes from, not from my own Temiskaming First Nation, because that's 6 hours north of me, disconnected from that community. But you know, that's where I'm coming from. Rama First Nation has a big Casino Rama. So there's a lot of, you know, issues and things that I've seen living on the res. And then I've worked in nonprofits for 3 years so far. The first one that I had an internship with in my 3rd year university was an Indigenous environmental NGO. And that was based on the land, on Algonquin unceded territory near Ottawa. And then also, like, my education, you know, living in Southern Ontario, my privilege as a white passing person, and also my non-cultural upbringing. You know, my mom was disconnected from her culture, so then I was disconnected from mine. And it's just, you know, that ripple effect, that intergenerational trauma from residential schools.
And that is all forming my perspective here today. So I don't really know the statistics off by heart, you know, Chimigwech for other, which means thank you in my language. Thank you very much for like sharing those statistics, Sydney, about Indigenous inclusion. And, you know, I just want to say, like, it's very depending on the organization and the knowledge that they have and the lens that they have when approaching their work and approaching people. So, you know, other people have been doing this for a long time, like engaging Indigenous people. Other people are just hopping on the bandwagon now of having Indigenous peoples included, you know, with land acknowledgements and everything. And we're on the right track. At least it's there. It's happening somewhat. So, you know, I want to speak to my degree, Indigenous Studies and Philosophy joint major. So that really, like, half of my major was focusing on Western philosophy. It should be called Western philosophy, not just philosophy, because there's many philosophical ways of looking at the world. And then the other half is Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous ways of knowing. And I had to reconcile that. And there was no crossover, but I worked and got both of the departments together to cross-list some of those courses so that people can be exposed to other philosophies and ways of knowing and approaching life. And often that is, Indigenous worldviews and approaching life is very misunderstood or even sometimes ignored in mainstream practices. And we don't see collaboration between worldviews often enough in everyday practices. So often Indigenous engagement is excluded from the main programs or activities, and outreach can be minimally thought out. And, you know, I understand that there's constrictions with nonprofits where they have certain time frames and budgets, and it's the way that society is structured. And so there's this clash between how Indigenous peoples do things and how the world runs. So there's limited engagement for that reason. So because people don't understand or have learned how to engage multiple perspectives. I'm really lucky to have had that education. So in my research, I really focused on Willie Ermine. He's from Sturgeon Lake First Nation, and he's an assistant professor at the First Nations University of Canada. And he talks about this concept of ethical space of engagement. So usually it's when two disparate worldviews clash. And so I'm going to read a little excerpt because I want to do it justice. So ethical space is formed when two societies with disparate worldviews are poised to engage each other. And this is the thought about diverse societies and the space between them that contributes to the development of a framework for dialogue between human communities. And the ethical space of engagement provides a framework and a way of examining the diversity and positioning of Indigenous peoples and Western society. So how do they engage in a respectful way? This ethical space of engagement is the requirement for relationships where you can learn from and respect each other. Like, it's built upon that. And representation of Indigenous ways of knowing and cultures really matters. And Indigenous peoples can see right away when they are not represented, when they are not key collaborators in your work. And if there isn't this collaboration and you aren't reflected, you won't be very interested to be engaged because you're not, you're not reflected there. So there's this also another approach is Albert Marshall. He's elder of the Mi'kmaq Nation, lives in Eswatini First Nation. And it's this concept of two-eyed seeing. We have two eyes. And this basically is when, you can understand Western perspectives and you also understand Indigenous perspectives. And, some people have that. Some people, we call it walking in two worlds. When you are in both and you can come from both places. But many people might not understand how to, or may never have this way of seeing things. And people can see it as threatening.
possibly, because they're so used to having things done a certain way, and they're maybe closed off from trying to see things from multiple perspectives. And it's not just always two perspectives, it can be multiple. You know, it's not just Indigenous and Western always poised against each other. But it's very important to see multiple worldviews and they acknowledge that it's there. And we're missing out when we lose the ability to see with these multiple perspectives. And everyone can benefit and learn more from collaborating with other cultures and perspectives, and everyone has something to bring to the table. But Indigenous knowledge is an entirely different way of living in this world, philosophically, culturally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and mentally. And it can, like, Indigenous knowledge is in all sectors in society. I often see it like Indigenous peoples are like, you know, we should engage them in the environmental sector, and that's their thing. But no, we have an entire, all sectors, all ways of doing things. And so there's, with all that, there's challenges to these including Indigenous peoples from where we're at. So we are often like way under capacity because we're in such high demand right now for training, for speaking. We are busy people working on all fronts to, you know, protect our communities. And we're intersectional peoples, like, you know, Afro-Indigenous people, there's so many, intersections that you can have, including my own. And then there's underfunding of Indigenous reserves. First of all, there's many barriers to that with, you know, clean drinking water, access to clean drinking water, access to housing, education. It depends on where the reserve is, really. Like in Southern reserves, we're a lot more privileged than others. And also environmental racism, where, you know, my community up north is a fishing community, and our lake is poisoned by mercury, so we can't even fish for our livelihoods, you know, by some company. And then, you know, being in crisis mode because of all of that, because missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit plus people, you know, so many different crises that our communities are facing at the same time. And then there's also the isolation of, you know, being a flying community, like food security. There's just so much. So there's those challenges to inclusion. But like an Indigenous approach can really enhance online public engagement and global citizenship education programs and activities, because it invites people to be more open to other ways of knowing. And it invites people to listen to the voices and perspectives of others. And this is really necessary in building a just society. I think a main problem in our society right now is people not listening to other people's experiences and valuing that and making adjustments based on that. And then nonprofits, we're meant to fill those gaps that are needed in society. And it's a great position to be in because you can engage across sectors. You can do advocacy work within the government, within grassroots communities. You know, we can tie it all together. And I think that's super important because, you know, sectors don't have to be siloed off. One thing affects the other, like, you know. And also, you know, Indigenous cultures really come from the land. So they're really holistic, and there's so much to learn from us, from Indigenous cultures from around the world, because it's based in natural law. It's envisioning a way to live with one another in a circular manner instead of a hierarchical manner. If that makes sense, it's hard to explain. So, you know, I like how my professor at the Trent University puts it, where, you know, we have human law, and it's like just a line like above the earth, like it's not connected to the land and the way the natural cycles go. And Indigenous ways of knowing can really bring that back down and remember the natural laws and the ways that that's how our societies are structured. So there's so much that we can offer in all sectors. You know, our SDG project, Advancing the 2030 Agenda here in Peterborough, we are centering Indigenous knowledges. It's, you know, the priority for the SDGs is leaving no one behind, but it's also centering Indigenous knowledges for where you are anywhere in the world has Indigenous peoples, that they know how to live with the land, be sustainable. Like, that perspective is key in making a just society for people and for the environment. So I also want to provide some effective tools for beginning this if you're, I guess, new to engaging Indigenous peoples in your nonprofit. So that's okay as long as you start. So educate yourself as much as you can first. Do your own research with credible sources and hear from Indigenous voices themselves. There's a lot of training resources online, or training resources are very important for your, you know, professional development. And then basically there's three: there's educate, there's relationships, and then there's the context. So the importance of building relationships with Indigenous communities themselves, First Nations communities, Indigenous communities, and also Indigenous organizations. There are many organizations that can connect you to other people because they do that work in the community already. And communities have their own protocols and ways of doing things, ways of consulting them, ways of, you know, how much do you pay somebody, you know, an elder, what's appropriate for these people. So a lot of First Nations have their own website, and you can go on there, you can find documentation of their protocols, and you can find how to contact them, and, you know, just build relationships so that you can understand their culture and their protocols better. And yeah, it's okay not to know, because, you know, I have to be kind even with myself, that I didn't know a lot of my culture and my protocols and that. But as long as you start is the most important thing, and approach it with respect and honesty and humility. And also want to point out that there's a time and a place for Indigenous only spaces, safe spaces for them to convene with each other, programs and activities. Like I've been involved in multiple Indigenous protected and conserved areas workshop. It's a new land designation, and we had, you know, people from all across Canada come together. And the first day was just Indigenous only participants, so that we could meet each other and, you know, get on the same page before we engage all people from different walks of life who you know, you never know who you're going to engage with in those spaces when they're coming from, you know, the government or whatever. And then the third one would be the context of your work changes when you collaborate with Indigenous people. So you have to make sure that you meaningfully collaborate with Indigenous people to co-develop programs and activities that are culturally appropriate. And you can put that into your whole way of doing things, you know, like you start and end with ceremony. You know, there's many ways that you can make it culturally appropriate and sensitive. And yeah, making sure Indigenous peoples are represented in that process of, you know, creating these programs as much as possible. Because I feel like collaboration is better than, you know, in one-off engagements. It's better to have it throughout the whole thing, if you can, as much as possible. And also, never assume that you know what Indigenous peoples need. Always go ask them, ask what resources they need, and do your best to accommodate this and work with them to accommodate them. And because there's so much that they offer, and then there's so much that you can offer. So working together to do the work. You know, thinking outside the box for engagement. You know, I know I'm zoomed out. There's like so many Zoom calls throughout the week, and you can engage people like outside, even like with certain measures in place. You know, I'm planning on organizing a outside, you know, pick up garbage campaign to clean up the local area, and you know, you really feel connected with those kinds of things, and you know, you can partner with your local organizations to do that. So another example is our neighbor plan. We're planning, well, Green Up is a nonprofit here in Peterborough, and they have this initiative called the Neighbor Plan, where they are working across sectors in Peterborough to figure out how to make outside spaces as, you know, as based on the needs of the people who live there. And they have this very good interactive tools where, yeah, you basically, there's lots of different online tools where you can like brainstorm and show people pictures, and you know, it's a lot better for accessibility when, you know, we're dealing with people who aren't educated and trying to engage them in these processes. That's really important. So I'm gonna end it there and leave everyone with a challenge. You know, you probably might already be doing this work, but read and listen, watch videos, listen to Indigenous voices, especially with Canada Day happening tomorrow. You know, listen to authentic, you know, First Nation, Inuit, Métis voices. I think that's really what's missing in a lot of these conversations about a just recovery, a just society. And yeah, build relationships with your local communities, with other Indigenous peoples around. And you might even be invited to experience some of the beauty of our cultures and some teachings. So yeah, thank you so much for having me in this space. I appreciate you all. Yeah, Wamapi.
Thank you very much, Shaelyn. Challenge accepted. Collaborate, ask questions, don't make assumptions. I think that's the biggest takeaway from your presentation that we all have right now. Actually, as you were making a presentation, I was thinking about how so very important it is to involve and to include anyone. I actually thought of the Madagascar issue. I'm sure a lot of us know about how Madagascar ended up pulling out from the United Nations because they felt as though we have something to bring to the fore, but it was not embraced in the way that they hoped. So I hope. So I'm confident that having conversations of this nature will enable us to think outside the box and to stop being so one-track minded, because the direction that we all are hoping to move is the forward direction. So at this time, we're going to take your questions. One of the questions I have is, thank you so much for sharing great ideas on the Uber cards and internet stipend. Were these sent out via a code attendees could use or mailed out? How did you implement? I think, Sydney, that one's for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I missed out on the implementation part. So for the most part, codes were sent by email to be able to either access gift cards or like electronic money transfers by using email addresses was kind of how we've done a lot of that. So even, for example, another thing that we did was we noticed that a lot of the youth we were engaging with, like Shaelyn mentioned, they were zoomed out. They didn't want to have another meeting. So we had like a trivia night and we had prizes for everybody. And we let them choose from a number of codes that they could access these gift cards. So there's a number of places that you can get them. You can also transfer funds directly. Luckily, within Canada, you can do that easily if you have a bank account. And if not, then we're able to send checks by mail for people who don't have access to a bank account. And we're able to kind of work around that in some ways, or provide in-kind services. So things like Joel was mentioning around providing equipment and other things when people don't have access to online means of redeeming those. But yeah, you definitely have to be agile. And I think all the panelists pointed to that. There's no one size fits all, and definitely asking the person who you're giving these things to first and giving them a number of options is what I found is the best way. So instead of, like Shaelyn mentioned, assuming what people need, kind of being like, hey, we have these options available. works best for you? How can we deliver that in the best way for you? Obviously a lot easier for smaller groups than for larger groups, but if we start small, we can eventually get bigger and bigger.
Okay, thank you, Sydney. Another question that we have is, how could you promote more ethical communications on social media for Black communities? Who wants to take that one? How could you promote more ethical communications on social media for Black communities?
Well, I could start off, if I may. Sorry, my office is very noisy in downtown Georgetown. So this is a challenge even here in Guyana. You know, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is happening in some form or the other all over the world where there are Black people. And certainly in our context, we've had an election stretching for over 120 days. We went to the polls on March 2nd and we still don't have a declaration of results. So, you know, that global conversation is intersecting with a kind of a local national conversation about racism, about homophobia and sexism and misogyny. I think we can use social media for education in the same way that people are using it to share their views, and for organizations that work in public education, public sensitization. Now is a great time to run online and social media campaigns. And maybe if I could share it in the chat, I found some great social media cards, if I could call it that, online with great tips about social media etiquette and what to post and what not to post, and to think about who's out there and being traumatized about seeing all of this. I think Sydney spoke about that in her presentation, that, you know, seeing all that's happening around the world to Black people is also a bit traumatic for a lot of us. So we also don't want to use, we also don't want to be in the space all the time. So having people, you know, sharing tips with people about how to use social media and thinking about who is out there and looking at their social media and their audience. And so far from what I've seen, that work is kind of just starting here. People are generally quite receptive to it, because I think really and truly, people just don't know. And when you bring it to their attention, it's not always just ill will. When you bring it to their attention, people are like, oh, I would have never thought of that. I just shared this or said this because I think it was interesting. I never thought about the impact or the effect it could have on somebody who's feeling traumatized about what's currently going on.
Thanks, Joelle. And then another question that we have is, what are the actions and issues for global citizenship? What are the actions and issues for global citizenship? I'd like for you to weigh in on that one as well, Lesley, from a youth perspective.
Thank you. So I believe a major challenge really right now, especially coming from a youth perspective, is challenging these organizations and systems of power where there's a lot of dynamics that really shape how a lot of people are engaged and their capacity of being engaged. And that poses a lot of barriers, especially for youth activists, for youth, for people of color, for people in the LGBTQ+ community, and so forth and so forth. And I believe the power relations or the power dynamics has caused a lot of actors that are in these positions to turn a blind eye, and that really holds a lot of people back in being fully engaged. So really one of the main things in order to move forward is to dismantle a lot of these structures. And there are so many ways of doing so. And I think that that's something that we all need to recognize as a primary challenge, and how we can be able to deconstruct that in order to effectively engage.
Okay, and then a follow-up question to that one is, what other actions and issues of public engagement corresponding to informal education? Maybe Sydney, you can take that one, and then after that, I have a question for Shaelyn.
Sure. I don't really know what necessarily informal education is, because I think that education comes from a lot of places, and institutions of education are not always the best places to be learning. So I definitely think that one of the actions we can take is really dismantling that idea of like what is formal and informal education, what is institutional and non-institutional education, and how we value it as a society. So I think that is one of the ways that we can kind of, or key issues that we can look at public engagement. And specifically when we talk about public engagement and global citizenship, like we talked about, everyone has talked about their own lived experiences of inequities. And these are just, we're just 4 or 5 people on this panel right now, but there are so many different ways in which people don't have access to these spaces for exactly that reason, of kind of the gatekeeping that happens when we formalize spaces for public engagement. And that is exemplified, for example, by people saying like, why don't Black people vote? Or why don't young people vote? Why don't Indigenous communities vote? Because those systems were not built for us to take part in them. So we definitely need to make sure that, I think one of the key issues, if you could sum it up as just one, is like, look at the systems and who is not being included in those, and understand the roots and the histories of those systems. We're talking a lot about police brutality, specifically in Canada, or for Indigenous and Black communities. And we're talking about, we need to fix the system. We don't need to fix it. It was built for policing Black and Indigenous people, and it will continue to do that if we continue to allow it to. So let's look at the ways that those systems perpetuate these inequities and start breaking them down, changing them, creating new ones. I think that that's a really important issue, and I think it can apply to so many different issues within social justice. And I think everyone on the panel has mentioned the best way to do that: center the people who are most affected. When we're talking about land rights, center Indigenous communities when we're talking about that across Turtle Island. When you're talking about police brutality in the US, center Black people's experiences. When we're talking about the LGBTQ community, let's make sure that we're including not just the LG and Bs. Let's have trans communities at the center. Let's have non-binary communities at the center. Let's have two-spirit communities at the center. I think that's just the biggest thing and the biggest takeaway from this discussion. We need to make sure that those are the voices that we're listening to, and we need to make sure that those are the voices telling us the issues that we can support on. Allyship and collaboration in this space is important, but it's also important not to take up space in areas that are really not meant for us to be the loudest voices in. So I know that's a lot and it's kind of big, but I think it's a good way to start, and it's a really good way to be self-reflective when we're doing this work. So yeah.
Thank you, Sydney. And then a question for Shaelyn from one of our participants is, how can we integrate Indigenous knowledge into the implementation of the SDGs at community level? How can we integrate Indigenous knowledge into the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals at community level?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a great question. We have just started doing that with our project that has just begun June 1st, and it's going to be a full year and a half. So at the community level, you have to engage everybody in the community first. So last year we had a forum on the SDGs where we taught people in the community what the SDGs are, first of all, and then what issues they've seen within the community. And we had people from the local First Nations, so it wasn't just in the Peterborough, city limits itself, but also the 4 Miccosukee First Nations that live in the surrounding area. So, we also had, knowledge keepers and elders present. So it's really, if you're doing that engagement, it has to be like grassroots with all of the voices, like as many voices as you can, as like representing different people in the community. So with our project, the way that it's structured, based on that forum, there's 5 key priorities. So we're focusing on 5 SDGs that we identified as being the most pressing in the Peterborough area. So we have action teams, 5 action teams for each one of those. And one of them is partnerships for the goals, and that's centering Indigenous knowledge. So we have an Indigenous consultant on the project and an Indigenous elder. So both of them, and also me, I'm a project coordinator for that. So within the very foundations of the whole project, you have Indigenous peoples there. You make space for those voices, and they're going to be in every one of those action teams, engaging people in our ways of knowing. So if they're missing anything from an Indigenous perspective, we can provide that, anything that we need. So really, we're going to also be working with the communities in what they're doing already for the SDGs in their communities, how they're going about them, about educating people, and about meeting those goals. So really, it's about engagement and relationship building all throughout the whole project, the whole process of doing it. I'll leave it there.
Okay. All right, thanks, Shaelyn. We are well within the time that we had set for ourselves. So we're going to take 1 or just 2 more questions, and then we're going to recap and reflect. This next question, the last but one question, is for you, Joelle. How does SASOD protect confidentiality of participants who may be members of the LGBTQ community and may wish to remain anonymous? How does your organization protect confidentiality of participants who may be members of the LGBTQ community and may wish to remain anonymous?
Great, thank you for the question. So in the context now of working online, when we did the survey, there was an option we used SurveyMonkey, where there was an option to not collect IP addresses. And this was also part of our ethics application for ethics approval. So that was one way to, and of course the survey was completely anonymous and confidential. Right now, we are actually doing a virtual Pride, which we started on June 17th, and it goes all the way to July 7th for our 17th anniversary. And one of the things that we said about virtual Pride is that it actually gives people an opportunity who would not come out to like a Pride parade, a Pride party, or anything more public to actually participate anonymously online. So like this evening, we have a quiz night, and we'll allow people on our Zoom for a quiz night under pseudonyms, not necessarily using the video on and so on, just to encourage participation from persons who don't want their name and face out there, but would like to participate in the community. So we've had to find different creative ways and different kinds of strategies depending on what we're doing, depending on the nature of the activity, to facilitate participation from persons who would like to remain anonymous. And I think this is actually, sorry about that, a loud truck passing by. And I think this is actually one of the strengths of actually working virtually and online, is that a lot of platforms actually facilitate that anonymity, so that even as host, SASOD does not necessarily need to know who those participants and who those beneficiaries are. It gives you the options to choose the name that you want to use a pseudonym. Don't put on your video if we're on an online Zoom and that kind of thing and so on. And a lot of that would not work if the activity was only physically and in-person, an in-person event where you just have to be present to participate. So that's one way that we've been doing it in the context of the pandemic.
Thanks, Joelle. Okay, I think at this point, we all have heard and learned so much. I'm going to hand over back to each of our panelists to wrap up in exactly 3 minutes. If we forget everything else that you have said on this webinar this afternoon, what would you want for us to take home with us? I'll start with you, Shaelyn.
I wasn't expecting that. All right. I would say, along with my challenge, to listen to Indigenous voices, hear their perspectives, learn the history. There's books like we have here where you can learn from elders who have written books about the history of where you're at. I think that would be the most important thing in how to place your nonprofit in the best way possible to engage Indigenous communities local to you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Shaelyn. Lesley?
Thank you. One thing that I have learned throughout these engagements is that we do come into spaces where sometimes people are in denial of our reality. And that should not shy us away from continuing to do the work that we need to do in order to see change. And as radical as this may sound, the denial of our reality is lethal to us. When people deny that there is systemic oppression, that really affects us. And we have to be loud in that sense. And as young people, we have that capacity to do so. And nothing should really stop us in doing that. And that is something that I think is really important in sharing when it comes to engaging in these spaces. Thank you.
Thanks, Lesley. And Joelle, what is the one thing that you want us to remember, to eat, breathe, drink, even as we engage in similar platforms and other spaces that may not be necessarily for public consumption, so to speak?
Well, I think it's kind of two-part. I think for the Global South context, especially for those of us who are based in and working in the Global North, to remember that in our context, there are often environmental constraints which are beyond our control when it comes to public engagement. So in the Guyanese context, we have scheduled power outages and unscheduled power outages, poor quality of internet that will limit and affect participation and public engagement in a COVID-19 world. And second to that, to appreciate those constraints or to recognize those constraints, I think Sydney said it most eloquently about centering the voices of marginalized people in these conversations. Listen, engage, ask people their views, ask them which platforms they would like to use, provide options, and don't just assume that, well, we use Zoom in Toronto, so Zoom is the way to go. Zoom might not work for everybody.
And last but by no means least, Sydney, what are some of the things that you want us to be thinking about and around?
Yeah, I think it's really just going to be adding on to what everyone said, but I think hopefully what you understood from my part of the presentation is if you're using the term intersectionality or saying that you're an intersectional feminist, make sure you know what it means. Make sure, like Shaelyn mentioned, that you know who created this theory and who it was intended for and how it's intended to be used. I think that's super important. Give credit where credit is due to a lot of these theories, especially when they're created by women belonging to identities that have been marginalized. And then the second thing is what's been mentioned by everyone, really make sure that you're centering the experiences of the people who are being left behind, people who are furthest from opportunity, and people who continue to not be able to show up in these spaces when we're talking about public engagement and global citizenship education. We don't want to make the mistake of recreating the inequities that exist in our physical world in our digital spaces. So we have an opportunity now not to do that or undo what's already been done, because there's definitely some damage done already. And I think if we continue to really think critically about how we create these spaces in a way that are accessible, that are equitable, that are safe, that we can do a huge service to a lot of these communities if we continue to put in the effort, educate ourselves, and put in that work.
Thank you, Sydney. And as a parting shot from me, I think history is going to remember us by how well we used the crisis to create opportunities and to carve and forge a way forward. So thank you to everyone who participated on this platform. We look forward to engaging with you more. I'm sure all of us are on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. Look for us. You'll find us. You've been staring at our faces for the last 2 hours or so. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to sift through the riffraff. From all of us, thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope and believe that the conversation is going to continue. Bye-bye.